is this Jesus?
Does he not really exist?
Most likely does not exist.
He doesn't exist!
He doesn't exist.
He doesn't exist.
So you meant...
That he doesn't exist.
Right.
What's the best case for mythicism that convinced you?
Currently, the full peer-reviewed hypothesis is described in Richard Carrier's On the Historicity of Jesus. Raphael Lataster's Questioning the Historicity of Jesus establishes a good foundation for remaining agnostic on the topic. Both works contain extensive footnotes and citations establishing that they are consulting the full range of academic sources to establish their positions. I highly recommend either book. Sometime around the turn of the 1st century CE, the Jews began to scour the Jewish scriptures for information about the coming Messiah. Our first indication of this is Philo of Alexandria. Philo was a diaspora Jew that was busy syncretizing Judaism with surrounding pagan and Hellenistic ideas. During this time of syncretization, Philo describes the Logos of God. This Logos is described by Philo to be the firstborn Son of God, the celestial image of God, God's agent of creation, and God's celestial high priest. He connects his Logos to an already existing archangel figure in Jewish angelology. He cites Zechariah 6:12 as a reference to this archangel, establishing that one of the names of this angel is Yeshua. Messiah was a pre-existent archangel that had been foretold in the Jewish scriptures. Next, we have Paul, who independently also identified a Messiah for Judaism through hallucinatory visions and scripture. Galatians 1:11 through 12, 1 Corinthians 15:1 through 8 indicate this. Paul clearly separates himself from any historical source concerning the gospel of Jesus in Galatians 1:11. Paul claims that Jesus Christ is the firstborn Son of God, which is in Romans 8:29, the celestial image of God, which is in 2 Corinthians 4:4, God's agent of creation, which is in 1 Corinthians 8:6. Separately from Paul, but contemporary to him, Hebrews records that Jesus is God's celestial high priest, which is contained in Hebrews 2:17 and 4:14. After Paul's epistles, all of the references to Jesus are dependent on Paul's work. The Gospels really only have Mark that is somewhat independent, although it heavily relies on Paul's work. All the other Gospels copied off Mark. Non-Christian sources are ultimately either fabricated, like with Josephus, or they just regurgitate what Christians were claiming at the time. The early church fathers like Papias, Justin Martyr, and others were not concerned with the historical nature of Christianity. They only cared about the theological truth of the religion. As far as we know through Paul's epistles, nobody was ever a disciple. They were only ever apostles, which meant that they had received a vision of the resurrected Jesus and not experienced Jesus before his death. All the evidence lies with Paul and what he thought about Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. So if Jesus wasn't a real historical person, then where did his death, burial, and resurrection take place? Whenever Paul refers to Jesus' birth, he uses words that are more indicative of manufactured rather than birth. Paul also describes Jesus' body as being similar to Adam's body and our future resurrection bodies. These are all manufactured by God. This would explain why Jesus' lineage never mattered to Paul and the early Jewish Christians. God had guaranteed that Jesus had Davidic lineage by creating a body of Davidic flesh for Jesus to use. Hebrews 9:22 through 24, while not written by Paul but contemporary to him, claims that there exists copies of everything on earth in the heavens. Paul's own theology admits that there are multiple levels of heaven in 2 Corinthians 12:2 through 4. The Ascension of Isaiah 7:10, a first-century Christian text, claims, "As it is above, so it is also on earth. For the likeness of that which is in the firmament is also on the earth." When Paul talks about who killed Jesus, he describes them as the, quote, archons of this aeon, or, quote, rulers of this age. This would be a weird way to refer to the Romans if that is who he meant, given that later Paul identifies Satan as the, quote, archon of this world. We also know that the phrase, quote, archon of this aeon, is commonly used at this point in history to refer to Satan and his demons. So it's reasonable to conclude that when Paul uses these terms, he's referring to Satan and his demons rather than human authority. According to the revelation of Moses, Jewish beliefs included the idea that Adam's body was buried in the heavens. Paul claims in 2 Corinthians 12:2-4 that a man was taken up to the third heaven where paradise, known as Eden, is located. A notion which is also contained in the revelation of Moses 37:4-5, 40:1-2, and 2 Enoch 8 and 9. Considering that Jesus' body was manufactured similar to Adam's body, it's quite plausible that early 1st century Jews and Jewish Christians thought Jesus was also buried in the heavens. At the very least, this idea would not be preposterous for them to believe. In Philippians 2:5-11, Paul is admitting that Jesus humbled himself by taking on a body of flesh and shed his godlike appearance. Jesus, a pre-existent being, descended, died, and then ascended back to his former glory. This is similar in nature to the ascension of Isaiah. In this 1st century Christian text, Jesus is seen as descending from the upper heavens, shedding his godlike attributes, and taking on a physical form in the lower heavens. In this physical body, he is persecuted, crucified, and killed by Satan and his demons. He is then buried and resurrected, after which he ascends back up to the upper levels of heaven where he retains his godlike image. All this incredibly resembles a mystery cult beyond mere coincidence. Starting with Philo, we have the Messiah of Judaism being identified with a pre-existent archangel figure who is named Jesus. Paul claims that Jesus became flesh and died, was buried and resurrected, all because the scriptures claim he did, as well as having that confirmed through hallucinatory visions. A plausible explanation for Paul's more ambiguous verses is that he considered Jesus only ever to be a celestial figure that performed all these events on a celestial plane right above the firmament of the earth.